Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Welcome to those who access the podcast through Rumble, Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. Today we continue in our study of the book of Genesis. We're in chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, which reads, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. That's Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Today we transition into Genesis chapter 16, where we learn that it had been 10 years since God had first given the promise of many descendants to Abram. But there was a problem. He had not one child. As we have seen, God made this promise to Abram 3 separate times in Genesis 12, 13, and 15. At this point in the narrative, Abram was 85 years old and Sarai was 75 years old, and time was running out. Abram and Sarai had probably been married for at least 50 years at this point, and it was pretty evident to them that Sarai was barren and would not have any children. This record of the life of Abram was clearly not written merely to give us historical facts about the distant past. Many who claim the name of Christ today are superficial in that they are concerned more about the amount of mileage there was from, say, Jericho to Jerusalem than with the distance between man and his lost estate and the heart of God. Though we find the physical details of Abram's life interesting, we must be much more concerned with the spiritual lessons learned from his life. In verse 1 of today's passage, we read, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant, whose name was Hagar. Hagar, Sarai's Egyptian maidservant, probably came into Abram's home at the time when they traveled down to Egypt during the famine in the Promised Land. While in Egypt, Sarai had been taken into Pharaoh's home in order to become his wife. This happened because Pharaoh didn't know Sarai was Abram's wife. When Pharaoh took her in, he gave Abram a great deal for her, including servants. Hagar was probably one of those servants. After coming into their own, they named her Hagar, as this was a Hebrew, not an Egyptian name. Hagar's name means flight, which is closely related to the term the sojourner. By the way, when we deliberately disobey God, we open up ourselves to all kinds of opportunities for the enemy to cause havoc in our lives. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and verse 5, we read, I have decided to deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. Due to sin, rebellion, and other factors, there are times when God has to simply withdraw his protective hand from us because we have chosen to willfully disobey him in an egregious way. And then, when things go sideways, we want to blame God for that which we caused. Getting back to today's narrative, we, like Abram, are justified by faith in God. We receive the gift of God's righteousness by simply choosing to believe. We know we possess it not by our efforts, but by our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Then we set out to please God because of all He has done for us. We did this by the only means we know, trying to be the best we can be. In time, though, we discovered that somehow our Christian experience loses its vigor, and instead of the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, and peace, which we were led to expect, we find instead nothing but barrenness. We have had the same problem as Sarai. This life, which is expected to produce immediate fruit, results only in barrenness, and it is difficult for us to understand. The problem is that we take things into our own hands. When the problem of barrenness begins to haunt us, we find ourselves yielding to the misguided proposals of the flesh or the self-life. In verse 2 of today's passage we read, "So Sarai said to Abram, 'See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her.' And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai." At 75 years old, Sarai realized she wasn't going to have children, and she certainly wanted them as much as Abram expected them. I'm sure that she thought, what am I doing wrong since God has given us a promise, but I'm not getting pregnant? So, by using the customs of the day, she did what any Canaanite would have done. She offered up her maidservant, Hagar, to conceive a child with Abram. According to the prevailing culture in Canaan, Hagar was Sarai's possession, and any children she would conceive with Abram would be the possession of Sarai. Therefore, the child would belong to her as much as to Abram. Of course, this is nowhere to be found in the Bible. Sarai resolved, through what struggles we can only imagine she had, to give up her own rights in an act of courageous renunciation. She gave up what is a wife's most precious possession, the right to have her husband's sole affection, and she offered her maid to her husband that he might have a child by her and thus fulfill the will of God. This, of course, was not only an act of real sacrifice, but also one of deep sincerity. She was not hoping that he would talk her out of this. She was quite prepared to go through with it. In verses 3 and 4 of today's passage we read, "Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes." As history has borne out, this choice resulted in endless sorrow and heartache to all concerned. The Arab nations who fight against the nation of Israel to this day originated in this act. And no sooner had Hagar conceived, Sarai began to act harshly toward her. We are so much like Sarai ourselves that we feel resentment at the idea that she should be blamed for this. Yet, if we do not learn the lesson here, we shall find our own walk with the Lord continually plagued with this problem of barrenness, and we shall miss the secret of fruitfulness. This story provides for us a picture of how we can walk in the Spirit and not fulfill the lust of the flesh. In fact, in Galatians, the Apostle Paul uses this very incident to illustrate this point. Sarai's difficulty was simply that all of her actions grew out of a basic philosophy which, put very simply, says, God has told me what He wants. Now the rest of it depends on me. God has shown me what the goal is, and it is up to me to figure out how to reach it. This is a very common and widespread philosophy, even among Christians. This is the place that the barrenness in our walk with the Lord leads us. As we read the Bible, we learn we are supposed to be conformed to the image of Christ. So we set out to start trying to be like the Lord Jesus. And then we make up a list of rigid rules for acceptable behavior. We become frightfully busy doing things for God. We work hard, perhaps to the point of neglecting our family. We sincerely try to meet His demands, and we do our best. We note how the community around us approves of our strenuous efforts, and we love the pats on the back for our faithful duty. But despite all the effort and sincerity, deep in our hearts, we know there is nothing in us but barrenness. The inauthenticity that barrenness creates repels others from the Lord. This happened to Sarai. Notice the appearance of selflessness, but the result was fruit. But it was Ishmael fruit, not Isaac fruit. The fruit of the flesh rather than the fruit of the Spirit, as Paul points out in Galatians. Both Abram and Sarai consented to do something that especially harmonized with the desires of the self-life. In all of this, we see their readiness to do the will of God without seeking to discover the way of God. This is always the heart of the problem. The immediate results of acting in the flesh will always be the same. We become petty and petulant, displaying enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, selfishness, and many other ugly emotions which lie ever near the surface of our yet fallen human hearts. Wherever these are evident, they are the thermometer which tells us we are being ruled by the self and not by the Spirit. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helping you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.